Hi, my name is Kreigsman. The title of this talk is Psychedelics and Substance Use Disorders. Thanks for getting here and getting on time for an 8 a.m. start on your Saturday. I reward you here with this very intensely colored backdrop. And thanks for being here. Thanks for those kind introductions. I'm going to go ahead and skip through the slide. You all know Ruth Potee very well by now. Neither of us have any disclosures. And I'm going to start this talk with a picture and take a poll. How many of the people in the audience have actually seen this picture before? I'm curious. Okay, I see one person actually. So this is a picture that's called the Bee Shaman. It's actually a cave painting from Algeria, which is believed to be somewhere between 6,000 and 9,000 years old, and is also thought to be the first artistic representation of the use of psychedelic drugs. Doesn't seem like such a stretch to look at this and think that the person painting this may have ingested psychedelic mushrooms. You can see the mushrooms sprouting from many parts of their body. And I have 2 points in sort of showing this picture. The first is you made it here for 8 a.m. Let me put up some cool artwork for your appreciation. But actually, in all seriousness, the real reason is to make a point that psychedelic compounds have been used by indigenous people across the globe for millennia. Here I'm going to show another picture. These are stone statues from Mexico, believed to be, the oldest one's believed to be about 5,000 years old. Halfway across the world from the Bee Shaman. And the point again I want to make is that these are compounds that have been used for millennia. And I'd like to believe that an equally valid and in some ways more valid talk could be given by an indigenous medicine person, as well as an ethnobotanist or a chaplain or a priest or a therapist or a psychologist. But the lens that I'm going to sort of focus on is the one that we're here for today, which is that I am a Western-trained, white addiction medicine doctor, and I'm speaking to an audience of addiction medicine providers, and that's going to be the lens with which I look at this through. So we'll go from those pictures to a headline here: 21 surprising famous people who've taken psychedelics. And the point I want to make here is that psychedelics have really penetrated popular culture in a way that we haven't seen for at least since the 60s, perhaps ever. We see people as diverse as Prince Harry and Mike Tyson and Miley Cyrus coming out very publicly about their use of psychedelics. And at the same time, this is from the Monitoring the Future study. So in 2021, there was a record high use of past year psychedelics. More than 8% of people in 2021 aged 18 to 30 reported using psychedelics in the past year. That was an increase of 200 to 300% from 2012. We also see at the same time, excuse me, a lot of advancements in the study of these drugs and compounds for medical uses. Here's a headline: psychedelic drug MDMA, also known as ecstasy, moves closer to U.S. approval following success in PTSD trial. So there's now 2 very positive phase 3 trials of MDMA for PTSD, and it's believed to be very likely that it'll be FDA approved and rescheduled by the DEA and available for use sometime even within the next year. In parallel with the medical advancements, there's also been a lot of changes in the local legality of the use of these compounds, and so localities and states and cities such as Oakland, California, Seattle, Washington, Denver, Colorado, now actually the whole state of Colorado, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Northampton, Massachusetts have passed local bills decriminalizing the use of certain psychedelics. And actually Oregon has taken it one step further, where there's now a legal pathway to get psilocybin mushrooms and to take them under the care of a licensed mental health provider. Now, noted these are still illegal in DEA Schedule 1 on the federal level, but there's many local areas that have moved to decriminalize, or even in this case sort of make it legal for the access to these compounds. And then finally, just in the academic world, the number 1 most viewed paper in addiction medicine, you can see the alptometric score there, an article from Michael Bulgenschulz in August of 2022, percentage of heavy drinking days following psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy versus placebo in the treatment of adults patients with alcohol use disorder. And so we'll go into this trial more in depth later, but just really wanted to give you the sense of the different ways that psychedelics are coming, and they're coming fast. And my hope for this talk today is to be able to catch you all up to speed with something that's probably going to really change our clinical practice in the next decade. Okay, and just to set the stage, I'm going to use a case here. So this is Carlson Recovery Center where I work, as is some of my friends here in the audience. And 40-year-old male with opioid use disorders admitted to ATS, using IV heroin for 6 years, 3 bundles per day. He's had 2 overdoses in the past year. He's got untreated PTSD and anxiety, childhood abuse. His ACE score is 7. We started him on a methadone detox, and then he denies induction, says, I don't want it. I want to do this on my own. And I imagine if all of you who are addiction medicine providers like talk the guy into methadone. So we talked the guy into methadone, and we were like, we've done our job here, right? In a lot of ways we have, and methadone's amazing, gets people's lives back together. But I think sometimes, I've been sort of thinking about this, what we're missing behind I want to do this on my own, is I think people are saying, I want to heal. Like whatever's driving me to use, like I actually want to heal that. And so I want to sort of plant that as a seed, and I think maybe what some of the potential that psychedelics have is to sort of work on a different level, and maybe to actually approach healing from a different place. And so I'm going to set that as a seed. And with that, I will pass it on to Ruth.
This is possibly my favorite slide in addiction medicine, and I think a lot of you know this. This is from the UK, and it looks at the harm to patients and the harm to others of most of the substances. And Ari and I discussed this one a lot because you'll see fentanyl's not on it. On the list, number 2 is heroin, and I think both Ari and I would agree that fentanyl is causing tremendous harm, obviously, to so many people, and probably alcohol and fentanyl are running neck and neck. What's important is just to acknowledge alcohol is a terrible drug that a lot of us use, and a lot of us use in an uncontrolled fashion, and people's lives are ruined. And the harm to others with alcohol, family members, the lady with the baby in the road yesterday, it's alcohol. And alcohol is bad. None of us, but this is the work we all do. So when you look at the list of the most harmful drugs, that top group of 5 or 6, that's what we focus on, right? But look at the bottom of the list. Look at the meds that really are very minimally harmful to the person using them, and also almost not harmful at all to other people around them. And that's a list of meds that we also use. Buprenorphine. It's a super safe medicine. So safe, so good. Like sprinkle it around the planet. It's good. But also at the bottom there is LSD. On the bottom there is psilocybin or mushrooms. And not quite the bottom, but close to it is MDMA or ecstasy. So this is the category of medicines that we're talking about, is here, again, low harm to patients and extremely low harm to others. The risk of developing a use disorder with these substances is also exceedingly low. Is it 0? Not quite, but it's close to it. And there's a reason for that. These are serotonergic drugs. They do not have that same crash and spike of the reward center or of dopamine. It's just not how they work in the brain. They're actually not super rewarding. And in fact, lots of people do it once and are like, I'm good. I don't need to do that one again. They're not universally pleasurable, to be honest. For some people, maybe, but lots of times not so fun. They don't have associated with them withdrawal or cravings. And the exception to that is ketamine. So ketamine, for people who are going to have a high risk behavior with ketamine, I'm looking at my nodding anesthesiologist in the room, Dr. Balin. There's a category of people who could get very used to ketamine and need to use it multiple times a day. And the notion that many of us in this room are going to be prescribing ketamine troches to people to take home and use at their will, I think most of us in this room aren't going to feel super comfortable with that. The way ketamine is delivered is not often in that fashion, though. Ketamine is delivered either IV or IM or through an oral or intranasal spray, and it's used in a supervised setting. So again, extremely low risk. And now I'm handing it back to Ari.
Great. Good. So there is a risk of psychosis with psychedelics, and just to sort of name this, I think people realized this probably in the 60s. And I think what I want to say is that psychedelics do carry risks psychologically of psychological harm. And I think since the 60s, when it was learned that it could cause psychosis or potentially trigger psychosis in people who are prone to it, that people with psychosis have been really excluded from the clinical trials. But we know, at least in clinical trials or when done in supervised ways, the rates of psychosis lasting more than 2 days is quite low, as you can see the numbers here. But there is a real risk of psychological harm that can happen with this. And so this was online interviews that were conducted, asking people to sort of weigh in on their experiences and if they'd had negative experience with psychedelics. And what you can see is that 39% of people who answered said it was one of the most 5 challenging experiences of their life. 11% put themselves or others at risk of physical harm. And the strongest predictor of a bad trip was the absence of physical comfort and social support. And we're going to actually talk about harm reduction towards the end. And I really want to sort of use this slide to sort of frame, like I think used in certain unsupervised settings, they do carry a psychological risk, but there are harm reduction things that can be done. And there's also ways that we can use this clinically to really avoid these risks. I'm going to talk now about mechanism of action. And first wanted to just sort of introduce a little bit of terminology. I'll walk closer to this monitor. So when these first came around, well, I guess when LSD was first patented by Sandoz Pharmaceutical in the 1950s, they would send it out to anyone who was interested. You could send to Sandoz and they'd send you vials of LSD, right? And they were interested to know what it could be useful for. And initially what they thought is it could give you a clinical model of psychosis that could be studied. And so it was initially the terminology that was used was a psychotomimetic. But they've quickly found that people who used it had a very different subjective experience in traditional psychosis, and that was sort of lost from the literature. I think the most common thing you still see is hallucinogen, meaning generating hallucinations. That's more and more falling out of favor, at least as we see in the literature, probably because a couple of things. One is the primary subjective experience is not often hallucinations. There's some changes in visual perceptions, et cetera. But it's usually more of a subjective experience of thought patterns, emotional experiences, rather than the hallucinogen itself. And also, since the 60s and 70s, the term hallucinogen carries a certain meaning or connotation with it. And so what we see the most these days is psychedelic, which means mind manifesting and sort of speaking to the subjective experience of almost accessing different parts of your brain, different emotions, different experiences. But it's a subjective quality. And it's little, when we think in medicine, we often like to think of mechanisms of action. We have opioid agonists and SSRIs. And just to say, when you see the term psychedelic, it's really speaking to the subjective mechanism. There is a way to split psychedelics. There's classic psychedelics, as you see here, which actually all share one mechanism of action, which is through the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor. We know if we block that receptor, you can really block all the subjective experience of psychedelics. And what you can see is all these molecules are very similar to serotonin. You have DMT. See if this pointer works. It doesn't work. Okay. But DMT in the top line, that's the psychedelic component of the ayahuasca brew. Shamans in the Amazon thousands of years ago probably realized that while DMT is inactive if you take it orally, they somehow knew that if you got leaves from another plant in the Amazon, which had an MAOI inhibitor in it, and you combined them, that then it would become psychedelic and active. And so the ayahuasca brew, the psychedelic component is DMT. You see 5-MeO-DMT in the top corner there. That's the active ingredient in the Bulfa alvarius toad venom. In the bottom right corner here, you have psilocybin and psilocin, which are the active ingredients in magic mushrooms. Psilocybin is then converted to psilocin, which is really the active molecule. You have LSD, which is a synthetic compound. And then you have mescaline, which is the active ingredient in peyote cactus, as well as the wachuma or San Pedro. And what you can say is that in general, broadly speaking, these all have the same subjective characteristics of them. They have different lengths of action, like 5-MeO-DMT, the length of action is like 15 or 20 minutes versus LSD, which is more like 12 hours. But this is classic psychedelics. There's also non-classic psychedelics, which have many different targets and again, have something similar in terms of subjective experience of them. The 3 that we're going to cover today are ketamine, which is an NMDA antagonist, ibogaine, which you can see is very complex pharmacology. We'll talk more about that in depth. There's a lot of interest in it, especially in the lay public in terms of use for addiction. And then we'll talk about MDMA, which is often sort of grouped together as a psychedelic, though it actually has a very different mechanism of action, also subjective experience. Doesn't cause the visual hallucinations or perception changes that you see with classic psychedelics, but it's actually been called like really like a perfect therapy molecule. It hits a number of different receptors that help you to engage in past trauma, but do it in a way that doesn't carry the fear response that might be otherwise. So we'll talk a little bit about MDMA as well. Okay, so quickly speaking, I wanted to sort of walk you through how the classic psychedelics work. That's where most of the research in addiction medicine has been done so far. So you can see that these 5-HT2A receptors are most densely concentrated in the areas of the neocortex, the human parts of the brain. The one that's been probably spoken about or taught about the most in terms of the area of the brain where this works is something called the default mode network. The way I like to think about the default mode network or talk about it is if you've ever tried to meditate before. If you're like me, you're like, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to focus on my breath, and like 2 seconds later, you're thinking ahead into the future, maybe about your to-do list, or you're thinking back about patients that you're worried about from last night. You think about relationships and stuff, and so this is a very active, but also very human part of being a human, right? It's very active. At the same time, it's actually been implicated in a whole number of behavioral health disorders. You can see the link, the list of here at the bottom. And it's almost like, we think about mindfulness and we're sort of learning about all the therapeutic applications of that. And sort of like the default mode network is sort of keeps what keeps you out of mindfulness in a way, sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a bad way. But what seems to happen with psychedelics is it turns off this hierarchical part of the brain. And what's left is that. Okay. Raise a quick hands if you've seen this slide before, a picture of this before. Curiosity. Right, some folks. So on the left is the connectivity between different parts of your brain under placebo. This is from an fMRI study. And the right is what happens with psilocybin. I'm just going to pause for a second. When I first saw that, I was like, whoa. And what seems to happen is when we sort of when the higher elements of our brain are turned off, it allows for communication to happen between large parts of the brain that don't normally communicate or connect. And this can lead to a very different subjective experience. One quick thing about psychosis, like psychosis might live over here more often, which is one of the reasons why we don't want to use, the thought is not to use this in psychosis, but for a lot of ruminative depression or PTSD or addiction in case where lots of things, lots of input, but even good things are happening around you, are sort of run through the same old brain pattern of like, I'm a bad person, I have shame, or through a trauma response. And the idea of how this might work is it allows for new connections to form. Cool. Okay, so one of the subjective experiences that can happen when new connections form is that people have mystical experiences. And this is a stained glass window from the Marsh Chapel at BU, and they did this famous study, the Good Friday experiment in 1962, where they gave 10 theology students psilocybin and asked the question, does this produce a mystical experience? And it turns out it did. 9 out of 10 people in this group actually had a mystical experience that really was indistinguishable from a traditional religious experience that people can have. And out of this, they came up with something called the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, which is now like a really highly validated tool in psychedelic research where you can actually measure and score people's mystical experience. On the right is Bill Wilson, founder of AA in many ways. What I actually only learned relatively recently was that he used psychedelics the first time to first have his mystical experience, which sort of triggered his thoughts around the higher power and the value of it in AA. And then later on also used LSD and actually advocated for it be included actually in the 12-step process because he thought it was like this valuable tool for higher power. And at least folks and patients that I've had, they often struggle with AA. One of the things commonly people struggle with is this higher power. And so psychedelics seem to be somewhat of a reliable way to achieve that. And what's also been shown, this is a paper from Roland Griffiths from Johns Hopkins, is that as you look at the mystical experience score on the x-axis, you see a real decrease in symptomatology across varying diseases here, whether it's tobacco use, depression, or anxiety. And so the thought is that these could really have a transdiagnostic mechanism across all, maybe perhaps all behavioral health conditions. And there's lots of, at least early phase trials that have been promising across a whole slew of mental health conditions. One of the other things that can happen besides a mystical experience is really psychological change, in addition to just a mystical experience. So this is a great qualitative research that was done hand in hand with that Bogenschultz article, which we'll get to later on psilocybin. But it asked people in that study, what was really the mechanism of change? And what they found was that it helped process painful emotions and past trauma, and that it also promoted self-compassion, self-awareness, feeling of interconnectedness, a sense of belonging, and improved relationships. And a couple of quotes for you from the study. The psilocybin freed up the things that were going on inside of me that made me want to drink, that made me not want to confront my life, what was going on in my life.
the psilocybin opened the door so I could get into spaces and see what was going on and do something about it. The fear, anxiety, and other negative emotions that were bound up with my drinking were dissolved by the psilocybin. Another quote. I would say that shame feels much smaller. It doesn't obliterate my sense of self. I can contextualize it as a momentary short-term emotion that's going to go away, and I don't have to be identified with it, but it's not a character trait, I would say. It's just a human feeling that's passing through. And with that, I sort of bring it back to this patient of mine who says, like, I want to do it on my own, or I want to heal. And I think what's interesting and exciting to me is psychedelics might offer a pathway for that. And then also secondarily, for those of us who work in addiction, like we experience so much secondary trauma. And I got to say, I have some of my own hopes that this will work for myself, that I can actually help sit with people or have patients who sort of actually process the emotion and PTSD and trauma that we all experience secondarily. Okay, we first have to see if they work for sure. And so for that, I won't get ahead of myself, but I'm going to use that as a segue into the state of the research. And so if you do a quick plug-in on clinicaltrials.gov for psilocybin, you'll see like there's 140 trials, almost like new trials added every week. And if you lump sum all the psychedelics, despite being DEA Schedule 1 with no known medical use, there are actually about as many studies as there are for buprenorphine right now. So it says a lot of things, but one of the things it says is the research is coming, it's coming fast, and we probably also need more research of buprenorphine. But I want to catch you up, just if you haven't been paying attention, just psychedelic therapy in general. And this is mostly going to focus on the research of what we know about for addiction. But I think I also want to point out that it's been given FDA breakthrough status for psilocybin for major depression, MDMA for PTSD, psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. There's also some very impressive studies on end-of-life depression and anxiety in cancer patients. I got to stand in front because I'm just that kind of person. I like to move around, but the clicking, I apologize for the clicking issue. So when we think about the research, just a couple things. It's a different paradigm, right? It's really hard to placebo control this. If you've gotten 25 milligrams of psilocybin, you know it. And also the therapists in the room know it as well. So this is an important thing as we consider the research, which is very positive. I think some of the critiques is like, is it all placebo? And I think one of the questions, does it matter? But also, how can we figure this out? And I think we don't know very much yet, but there was one trial, which I'll get to a little bit later, by Robin Carhart-Harris, where they asked people beforehand, there's a psilocybin versus escitalopram for major depression. And they asked people, like, what's your expectancy of how the psilocybin will be? What's your expectancy of how the escitalopram will be? What they found is there actually was no correlation between people's expectancy of psilocybin and actually the outcomes. Well, there was actually a correlation with escitalopram and the outcome. So we're beginning to try to get that sense, but then we have to really think about the placebo as well as the nocebo. If you get yourself into a psilocybin trial because you've read so many great things about it, then all of a sudden you get the placebo and you're like, damn it. And like, is that gonna affect people in a negative way as well? So we got to think about that. We also have to really think critically about the generalizability of the studies that are done so far. You can see 89% of research subjects have been white, which is very problematic. And that the studies that many studies really exclude people with serious mental illness or multiple substance use disorders. So we still have to think about how generalizable this is for the patients that we see. The other thing is the treatment paradigm is very different versus taking a medication every day, whether it's a methadone or an SSRI. These are medications, so this is from the psilocybin for alcohol use disorders trial. And what you'll see is people get medications on 2 days. And the other thing you'll see is this is very psychotherapy heavy. So remember that term medication-assisted therapy? Well, we're bringing it back. No, because this really, I think, at least what we think is that this is really medication-assisted therapy, right? It sort of lubricates the possibility for therapy. And it's not the medication alone that produces the effect, but it's impacted by the sort of state of mind of the person, also where you do it and who you do it with. And we know that when these are done with proper set and setting, they're very, very safe. Like there's been almost zero negative outcomes from a psychological perspective in these trials, with a couple exceptions. But point though is another piece I want to say is this is 2 therapists in the room in MDMA and psilocybin for 6 to 8 hours. And of course, I'll say quickly is it's a non-directive psychotherapeutic approach. The idea is that you actually sort of let people guide themselves, that there's some inner healing wisdom that happens and comes through. That's the sort of psychotherapeutic model. And that, but it obviously brings up questions of, when I made this slide, I said, if they're rescheduled, how will this be scaled? But it's really a question now is like, when these are rescheduled, how will we scale this? Which is probably a conversation for a different day, but important to think about. So timeline and research, finally going to get into studies, but you can see is in the early 60s and 70s, there was a lot of research, 40,000 subjects with psychedelics. And a lot of that early research has been criticized for methodological issues. And you can also see now that there's a huge influx now of psychedelic trials. But the first trial we're going to look at, and we're going to group these by substance use disorders, is LSD for alcohol use disorder. And so this is a meta-analysis. It's published in 2012 of the 6 randomized control trials of a single dose of LSD versus placebo for alcohol use disorder outcomes. And what you can see is that 59% of individuals at 1 month improved versus 38% in the control group. The authors also group it and sort of compare it in a number needed to treat compared to our current medications that we have for alcohol use disorder. And what you can see is that with LSD, there was an improvement in alcohol use, number needed to treat of 6. It compares pretty favorably with naltrexone, and helping people maintain abstinence from alcohol with the number needed to treat of 7. So this is a single dose of LSD once. And actually not all of these trials actually had a psychotherapeutic component to it. The next trial we'll look at for alcohol use disorder, this is now many years later, like 50 years later. So you can, and you can really feel that gap in research that happened with the passage of the Controlled Substance Act in 1970. So a huge gap in research, but it's coming now. So this was Michael Bolgen-Schultz. It was a randomized control trial comparing psilocybin to diphenhydramine as trying to give you some active control. People got 2 sessions, and the primary outcome was a % of drinking days. Here they excluded major psychiatric disease, other SUDs, and the average person had a severe alcohol use disorder, though people with moderate alcohol use disorder were also included in the trial. And what you can see is that if you look at the graph here, people very quickly improved in both arms, which is interesting. But if you follow people, they follow people out 36 weeks, so 9 months out, and you can see that 10%, basically 10% of heavy drinking days in the psilocybin group versus 23% in the Benadryl group. And the secondary outcome, which is pretty striking to me, is both that, wow, 24% of people in the placebo arm are abstinent at 9 months, which I think speaks to a couple of things, but one is actually the intensity of the psychotherapy of this. But also it's pretty striking is 48% of these people were abstinent from alcohol 9 months out. So continuing along alcohol use disorder, there's been more and more papers coming on ketamine for alcohol use disorder. I'm just going to choose one, which I think is the furthest along. So this is a 4-arm randomized control trial where people were either randomized to ketamine or saline or to a mindfulness-based therapy or just alcohol education. And they got 3 ketamine sessions. And the primary outcome was self-reported percentage of days abstinent days, 6 months out. And what you can see in the graph here is that there's, the 4 different treatment arms and the bars are overlap with each other. But if you look at the folks who got ketamine versus those who got placebo, there was a difference in 10% of days abstinent at 6 months out. And there's no significant difference in the rates of abstinence. It's a pretty small trial. But a couple of things are notable about this. Ketamine, what we know for treatment-resistant depression, is like a twice-a-week drug for 6 weeks. And it seems to be that the effect actually wears off pretty quickly, fortunately, in most cases. So 2 things here. I think one is that there seems to be a durable outcome sometime out, looking 24 weeks out. And this is also the first trial of actually combining really ketamine with therapy versus ketamine alone. And so speaking to including that psychotherapeutic component, most of the treatment-resistant depression trials just gave the molecule. We can move to psychedelics for tobacco use disorder. So this is a trial from Matt Johnson, an open label study, 15 participants. The average person had smoked a pack per day for 30 years and had 6 previous quit attempts. And they were given 3 doses of psilocybin, and at 6 months out, 80% of the people were abstinent, confirmed with biomarkers. And they did a follow-up study to this. 12 months out, 67% of people were abstinent. 60% actually had long-term follow-up or abstinent 30 months out. And the caveat is, okay, it's an open label study, but was it a placebo? And I'm like, does it matter? These people, it doesn't matter. I'm not sure. But I will say though that based on the results of the study, it was the first NIH-funded psychedelic trial in 50 years, is now ongoing, is finished recruiting with a single dose of psilocybin for tobacco use disorder. Have to see what the results of that will be. And just interestingly, 87% of the people in this trial rated it as one of the 5 most meaningful experiences of their life. And as doctors or providers, like, how do we even make sense of that as an outcome? It's like, it's a different paradigm, right? Is that important? I would say that's important, but it's not a traditional thing that we look at, right? Okay, opioid use disorder. There's not a lot out there yet. And Ruth is always like, don't include the naturalistic study slide, it doesn't matter. And I think it's important. But I think it's like, I mean, I think it's interesting, and there's, you know, so many people out there using it. There's this huge uncontrolled experiment happening. So what we know, so this is the Association of Psychedelic Use and Opioid Use Disorders among illicit drug users in the United States. And we found that compared to all other drugs studied, psychedelic use was the only one that was associated with a reduced risk of past year opioid use disorder. Every other drug except for marijuana was positively associated with opioid use disorder. And marijuana was associated with a reduction in past year opioid use, but not past year opioid use disorder. So naturalistic study, do what you will with it. This is another naturalistic study, but I'll run through quickly, where they did interviews with people who use drugs in the Vancouver area every 6 months, and sort of followed them and try to see an association between whether they use psychedelics and how that might affect their opioid use. And what they found was that people who use psychedelics had a significantly reduced odds of subsequent daily opioid use, odds ratio of 0.45. So there's not a lot yet in the opioid use disorder world, but there's a lot of trials that are ongoing right now. Ketamine psychotherapy for heroin addiction, immediate effects, and 2-year follow-up. So there's a gentleman in Russia, Potee, who's done a lot of research, and this is published in JSAT, who's done a lot of research with ketamine. It's hard to know what to make of a single center trial in Russia. Big caveat, okay. But what they did was there 70 patients who first went through opioid detox, and then they were randomized to 1 session of a low dose ketamine, which probably has some effect, versus a very high dose, actually 2 mg per kg of ketamine. And what they did is they followed people out for 2 years. I guess they're able to do this in Russia. What they found, I mean, if you look at various points in time, say 4 months out, the people who'd gotten just a single dose of ketamine, 50% of them were abstinent versus something around 28%. And then Kreigsman asked the question of, okay, what if we give multiple drug sessions, and how might that impact things? And so people who'd got that 1 dose session were then randomized to just sort of therapy or to receive 2 more dosing sessions. And what they found was a year later, 50% of the people who'd gotten multiple treatments remained abstinent. Okay. Ibogaine. I'm curious, raise your hand if you've heard of Ibogaine. Everybody, okay. Anyone had a patient ask them about Ibogaine? Oh, lots of folks, okay, cool. Okay, so it comes from the shrub, iboga is the plant, Tabernath iboga, which is the plant, grows in a very small area of West Africa, has been traditionally used by the Potee people there, ceremoniously. And it's very interesting and strange pharmacology. It's not fully understood, but it's an NMDA antagonist. It also has kappa and mu opioid activity, as does its very long-acting metabolite. It also has serotonergic nicotinic activity. And it got sort of, there's like a huge underground movement around this. And it started, like, I think in the 70s or 80s, some group of like 18 people got together and took it recreationally. And it turned out that of those people, 7 people had an opioid use disorder. And after taking Ibogaine, they didn't have any withdrawal. And they said they never used opioids again. And again, this is the underground world, right? I don't know how that worked in the 70s and 80s, but it quickly spread. It's not like, I mean, now we have Reddit and all these other things, but it quickly spread. So there's a really large underground medical tourism scene. Many people going to Mexico for this. There's a paper actually been written on special ops and Navy SEALs. There's a whole pipeline of people who are going to Mexico to get this treatment. What's a little problematic with it, you know, the classic psychedelics, whether it was LSD or psilocybin, like, they're very non-toxic drugs, as Ruth spoke to. Like, there's like almost no lethal dose 50 for those compounds. Ibogaine is different. It really does prolong QT. There's been a few studies of people watching people's QT activity while they take it, and like the average person goes up to 95 milliseconds. And similar to methadone, it's got some P450 stuff, so some people are going to metabolize it much more slowly than others. And so there was like one observational trial in New Zealand where there was a death from cardiac toxicity. But nonetheless, there's people who swear by it, and your patients are traveling places. And there's not a lot of good data to know in a controlled way how well this really works. I thought I'd just sort of share one, just to sort of share like a little bit of the data of where Ibogaine is right now. So it's 30 people. It's observational data from a clinic in Mexico. The only one who really sort of reported abstinence rates, self-reported 1 month out. So 50% of people remain in abstinence. And they use the SAO scale here, but other ones have used the cows. And it really does prevent opioid withdrawal, which is very interesting. And whether it has some benefit above that, above other psychedelics, is it just the opioid withdrawal component that people are really responding to, or is there some added benefit above that, maybe compared to other psychedelics, remains to be seen. And with that, okay. So we're talking about addiction here, and addiction is trailed probably because stigma and the concerns around exposing people to these substances. Unfortunately, the research in addiction has trailed other indications. But I want to catch everybody up to speed because, as we know, all of our patients have trauma. Okay, so I'm just going to cover two trials just to make sure we're all up to speed. So this was the first of 2 phase 3 studies of MDMA for PTSD. The second one was just published, was also very positive. The average person that's had severe refractory PTSD for 14 years and had failed 3 med trials and a number of psychotherapeutic trials to get into it. And what you can see is the control group, 32% of people no longer met criteria for PTSD, which is actually, again, speaks to the quality probably of the psychotherapy that's given. But if you look here, 2 months afterwards, 67% of people with refractory PTSD no longer met criteria for PTSD. And what they know from the phase 2 trials is that number actually gets better when you look at a year. So there's some real durable effects of this. And it's mostly, almost exclusively been studied for PTSD. There's a small positive pilot study for alcohol use disorder, actually, which we didn't include just because of time. But this is coming, and this is coming fast, and so many of our patients have trauma. The other thing, speak to just from a psilocybin for depression piece, which is obviously lots of our patients have co-occurring depression. This is, I think, the furthest along the trials in my mind, and this was a randomized control trial of psilocybin versus escitalopram for depression. People got either 2 doses of psilocybin and then placebo daily for the escitalopram piece, or they got 2 doses of placebo on the dosing days in escitalopram. And it was interesting, when this came out, this was sort of billed as a negative study because there was no statistically significant difference in the primary outcome, which was the quick inventory of depression scale. So you can see there was a trend towards favoring psilocybin versus the first-line treatment that we have for depression. But if you look at every other scale, and having read a lot of the different trials of psilocybin for depression, it's pretty random what primary outcome people use. Some people use the Hamilton Depression Scale, some use the Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale. You see the back to depression inventory there. Pretty much every other secondary outcome favored psilocybin. And this is a very small trial too. I think there was like 40 something in each arm. So these are coming. Psilocybin is going to be further down the pathway. It still needs, they're just recruiting for phase 3 studies right now, but these are coming. They're coming fast, and our patients are using them because they're hearing about this research. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Ruth. Our patients are using this. What do we do? It's harm reductionists.
So I don't need to talk to this room about harm reduction. It's what you do every single day. Having said that, we have to think about this for all of our patients who will actively be seeking treatment of their own accord. So I hope that when you're sitting in your OTP or your OBOT or your wherever you're working, that you're talking to people about not using alone. We all know this. We want our people to know that. And we encourage people to use with other people always, and to use sequentially, and to test, and to do 1,000 things. We know everything in our world has fentanyl in it. I think you guys know this, right? But Massachusetts has the overdose prevention hotline that you can call, and somebody will basically be with you while you're using. The Never Use Alone is a national program. Did anybody in the room listen to This American Life? The Call, right? How powerful was that? It was amazing. And even for those of us that do this work every day, I mean, I was bawling. I mean, like, she was a Massachusetts kid. We knew her. Like, it was just an amazing story. So if you haven't listened to it, 2 weeks ago, it's called The Call on This American Life. And it talks about what it's like to staff these call lines. If you don't have these cards from mass overdose prevention for your office, please get them. Really talk to people about it. And they're probably out back. Are they out back? They're out back on the table. Okay. So here's a patient case. You have a patient you've been working with for 6 months with their alcohol use disorder. And they came to tell you, look, I'm planning on doing some psilocybin mushrooms later this month. And they had heard it might help with alcohol use disorder. And they want advice from you. Just anybody have any advice they might want to give somebody about that? Yeah. Absolutely don't do it alone. Like, doing it all by yourself, if your experience is really, really bad and you need emotional support, it'd be really nice to have somebody there with you. Absolutely. Somebody else? Yeah. Yeah. Be really well informed about what you're doing and what you're actually using. And in fact, what I would argue is really important, Peter. Yeah. Stay hydrated. Okay, good. Like these are all like really good positive feedback we give to somebody, including like one, don't do it alone. If they say it, but I'm going to go see somebody, ask some questions about that. Like, what will that experience be like? You're going to be in an altered sensorium. How well do you know this person? Is it more than one person in the room? Is there any vulnerability that you're exposed to being altered with another person in the room? We don't want anybody being assaulted while they're under the influence. This is extremely important. Bad things will happen. We can all predict that. And yet we need to sort of work towards having bad things not happen for our people. We're a bunch of harm reductionists who believe that fentanyl is in everything. It could have been in my bagel this morning. So freaking test the drug supply. Unless you grew it yourself or you literally went to the house where somebody's growing or making the drug, you should presume it's not safe. And there's fentanyl test strips in the back. But that's my biggest fear, and Ari's biggest fear about this is that we're going to have a cross-contaminated drug supply, that the same people that cut fentanyl and cocaine down the street are going to be handing out psilocybin, and that's going to be cross-contaminated, and that will kill people. Because most people who are using the psychedelics do not have an opiate use disorder. So that would be I think the number one thing I would say to this person is, what's your supply and is it safe? So there is the equivalent of don't use alone for the psychedelic world. And Ari and I don't have no financial stake in anything. There might be another one out there like Fireside, but Fireside is really good. Ari and I watched the head of Fireside present a couple of weeks ago, and it was extremely impressive. And they're available 11 to 11. It's free. And you call, and you can either call before your trip, during your trip. You can call 5 weeks after your trip to help process and integrate. And the people they have answering the phone are peers. They're extremely well trained. It takes a year to train to be a peer for Fireside. I don't know how they fund it. I don't get any of it. I'm sure at the end of the day, there's going to be a lot of money in the psychedelic world. I'm sure somebody's funding this. But Ari and I think, speaking for you, we were both quite impressed with the work that they do. And they have categories that are for vets and for people, anybody. They have subcategories, so you can really talk to somebody about your experience with somebody on the other end who might be able to connect to you. This is just one of their internal data. And what they described is that 66% of the people who did call this peer support telephone hotline said that they agreed or strongly agreed that they were de-escalated from a very strong negative emotional experience or distress. So, I'm not going to ask people in this room who've ever done psychedelics, but lots of things certainly can come up, particularly with people with trauma. And I think doing it alone just doesn't make any sense. And I know what people do in college and they're hanging out in the dorm room. This is not what's being described. If this can be therapeutic, it needs to be done in a therapeutic environment with people who could keep you safe and could give you guidance. It's extremely important because sometimes people do make really bad, unsafe decisions, and we don't want that to happen. So this is the state of our nation right now on this. And there are a couple states that have basically legalized it, and that is Oregon and Colorado. And they have a ton of rules and ways it can be purchased and how it can be managed. Oregon is live and running, and I think the cost is $4,000, Ari? Up to, it's extremely expensive, and of course no insurance pays for it. Colorado, we think, goes live, I think, in 2025. I haven't quite dug into all their rules. It's sort of like not worth looking at the rules until it actually goes live to see what they're doing. But lots of those other states, those light blue states, are states where they are considering legislation. So legislation at the state houses or a ballot measure is possibly happening. But that's a lot of the country that's making moves. What's happening in our great state of Massachusetts? So there's two legislative bills that are out there. There's H3589, and then there's another one that is actually one of our representatives from Western Mass that opens up and legalizes psychedelic plants and fungi for people over 21, or could open up the use of these so-called plant medicines. And it's spelled out in the second bill, but it's for psilocybin, psilocin, DMT, mescaline, and ibogaine for people 18 and over. So where have these gone? Probably nowhere yet. As you guys know, legislation takes years sometimes to pass, but those are happening. And if you think to yourself, wow, I really want to help this process, call your rep, like start calling them. Because at the end of the day, I think this is a better approach than the next approach, which is this ballot measure. So we know that Andrea Campbell certified 40 ballot measures. They have to get the signature. So there's no ballot we're voting on this November. It's all next November, 2024. I think you guys know how this works, but you have to be certified to be considered. Then you have to collect all these signatures to show up on next year's ballot. These two ballot measures feel like they're sort of proposed by the industry is what I will say. They're similar to what's happening in other states. And they, it feels to me like the way it's going to look is sort of making the psychedelics fall under sort of the equivalent of the cannabis control commissions. So it'll be sort of a psychedelic control commission. You'll be able to buy these in a store. You'll have to sit with people who have a specific licensure, which is fine. It's all well and good. I get it. But I'm a social justice person the way you all are social justice people. And it's going to tick me off. And it ticks me off now that the only people that are going to have access to this treatment is people with money. And those aren't our people. Right? When Ari's up here talking about this stuff, you're all sitting here, like, that doesn't apply to my people at AdCare, right? Like, who is this really going to get to in our world, right? If we were in charge of deciding who needs this medicine, right? Our people need this medicine. People who are incarcerated need this medicine. Vets need this medicine. Like, get it into people who really need it. And like the, you know, the tech bros in Silicon Valley, well, they'll find their own way. I'm not so worried about that. So I am concerned about the ballot measures. They seem really highly structured and rigid. And this could be this very interesting circumstance we enter into medicine different. I can't find an equivalent yet, but there's going to be an above ground movement that's being studied that's going to cost, and there's going to be a below ground movement that is happening robustly. We won't know what the hell's going on. It won't be studied, but it will be interesting to watch these above and below ground movements. So as Ari said, 6 towns in Massachusetts, the language is deprioritized enforcement of laws. They didn't legalize it because you get in trouble with the DEA a lot, but deprioritized enforcement is basically the same. So half the towns are 413 Western Mass, but Salem, Somerville, Cambridge, East Hampton, Northampton, and Amherst, and more towns are doing this. Okay, so you're sitting here with me and with Ari, and you think, wow, this is actually really interesting. I should know more. So coming right up around the corner, our MGH people are in the room, but I went to this MGH conference. I have no financial stake in this either, but I thought their conference that I attended last year by the Mass General, 3rd annual conference on psychedelics and psychedelic medicine, is November 3rd. So it's upcoming. I think it's both in person and online. You might want to look it out. But also you should go online and look at the Boston Psychedelic Research Group, BPRG. They're our local group. There's a lot of psychedelics happening in Massachusetts right now, period. Just is. There's research going on, but there's a lot of activity. And if you think this is an interesting subject and you're thinking about what you might be doing for the next 20 years and you want to help people get better, this might be a way to do it. So we want you to learn more. We have time for a few questions, and please come up to the mic if you have them. I'm going to just personally tell you that the best thing that's happened to me in the last 2 years is that Ari Kreigsman has entered my life, because how good is this guy, right?
Good morning, Sam from Northern Maine. Just had a question. Any data on return to use with the alcohol, patients with alcohol use disorder?
Like in terms of, yeah, I think like further out, like there was the psilocybin trial, which tracked people, I think for 36 weeks, like meaning after that happened. Yeah, I'm sure they're going to follow that. Like, I think it takes a little while to sort of learn, like, what do these folks look like a year, 2 years out? Similarly with the ketamine trial. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but I think that's what's really wonderful, like the tobacco study, for example, that they then follow it. But I think it's new enough that we don't know yet. And I think it opens the question of, might there be some additive effect with further dosing down the line too?
Hi, Michael Medlock, Addiction Medicine, North of Boston. Nice to see you. Appreciate the presentation. Are there any, is there a group of people who have any permanent problems after the use of these that linger for long periods of time, or do they all recover promptly? A second question is age. Elderly patient with alcohol use disorder versus somebody young, are they at higher risk for a complication? Thank you.
You'll have to remember, I'll answer the second one first, maybe. So, interestingly, there's this end of life studies now with people with terminal cancer, and they seem to be very well tolerated in that group. Across the board, they seem to all increase blood pressure somewhat. So I think you need to keep that in mind with somebody who's got, say, unstable cardiovascular disease. That'd probably be the main thing to think about, but they seem the safety piece. And what I should say is I'm slicing it for the psilocybin side, like the classic psychedelics have very low toxicity. Something like MDMA, you'd have to be much more concerned about. It's a substituted amphetamine, as well as, ketamine can raise blood pressure as well somewhat, but it's also relatively safe.
Yeah.
And your first question, just remind me, was?
Long-term side effects
Oh, great, yeah,
from single
good.
use, from
Yeah.
just
So,
short-term use.
I think the first way to slice that is, are we talking like in a clinical scenario or not? And so, outside of clinical scenarios, there's definitely like this hallucinogenic persistent perceptual disorder, which is a very rare thing where people sort of have changes in their perception for a while afterwards. It's very rare, like in the order of maybe like 20,000 people, but that's a rare thing. I think if you use in the wrong context, you can really have it's very real. You can have psychological harm from this, be re-traumatized, and that can persist. In the trials, that seems to be very, very rare.
Thank you.
I don't know if you remember, there's an early slide that Ari showed that talked about the impact. And the thing that was so impressive about it is it's all the stuff our people need more than anything else. They talked about this improved social connection and feeling of self-love and being present. And I mean, if that was the medicine we could deliver with our average addiction patient, that would solve all of our problems. And that does seem to be for so many people how they feel after good quality treatment with a psychedelic. And our people are so isolated and there's so much self-loathing, right? The self-loathing is the last thing that goes away. And again, it does seem to shift. And that was one of the early slides. And again, these slides are available to everybody. The whole thing's recorded. Anybody who wants a slide deck will give you. So, because Ari was racing through at my bequest, all of those studies. And I know you were all like, wait, what did that say? So go back and look at the slides. Calla?
Calla, BHN. Are there studies looking at EMDR versus psilocybin assisted? Because it has that same kind of goal of addressing the trauma, but without the anxiety.
Not that I'm aware of, but
Okay.
there's a good chance there might be. If you look at like what's being studied, there's such a broad range of indications, but also comparisons or additive. Like there's probably also the question of what could it be an additive therapy to use, but I'm not aware of something specifically with the EMDR.
And then I had a patient who disclosed 5 days after they had done it, that they had done self-DMT to try and treat their addiction. And so I couldn't do the harm reduction up front, but some of the harm reduction I did after was, tell me about your sleep, and tell me, what's been your experience the last few days? What does your partner think about your behavior? Are you taking more risks? So doing that kind of assessments with the patient afterwards, and having a plan if they needed, some assistance. And then also the harm reduction for return to opiate use disorder. So they had stopped for some period of time. And so we also talked about when would you need to come back into treatment? And what would be some signs for that?
I have about a half a dozen questions. I'll pepper you with them later. Okay. So in the work that's done within the context of study, there's a guide who sort of who presumably is not dosed themselves and is leading the person through this. So if you have a patient who wants to do this and you work with them to identify somebody who would fulfill that kind of a role for them, how do you meet with that person and sort of speak about what the issues are and how, what the process is, and sort of walking somebody through thinking about, say, their alcohol use in that context? Is there work that you do?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. There's embedded in that is what can we as medical professionals right now sort of share and how far to go into it. And like, I think there's maybe something prospective around bringing somebody in, which might be a little bit worrisome. But I do think that I might sort of refer them to call that hotline where they could sort of speak to someone. There's a great resource who could help frame this for you. That's probably how I might handle that in this point in time legally. But I think maybe somewhere down the line, I think that could be a place where we could welcome people in clinically and do that.
Hi, Paloma. I have a question about synesthesia. Has that been explored? Has anybody that's taken psychedelics had synesthesia? How does it affect synesthete's brain? Has that even been talked about?
And synesthesia meaning like the mix of different perceptual qualities, almost like being able to see music play. Yeah, it's a well-described phenomenon in psychedelics that people often, probably this chaotic brain situation.
Right, but for somebody that has it without psychedelics.
Ah, like using it to treat that?
No,
Or-
just using, just in general. Just in general that's something I have never heard being talked about for substance use disorder. How is synesthesia related to substance use disorder? Has there been any studies or anything like that?
I don't know.
I
That's a
figured
great
that was
question.
the answer, but I just wanted to put that in everybody's head. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much.